Your thoughts become reality. Focusing on the tragedy. And now I'm fucking my PC. I am the end. All violating you. I am incredible. Desecrating you. And now I'm what I hated. Triggered something activated. I am Neanderthal. Berserker. Slicker stoves a mammoth. This gets a bone. There's too much information in this age of stone. Your thoughts become reality. A self-fulfilled.
Okay, here we go. Hanging out with Josh Cutchin. We're talking about Where the Footprints End, the new book he worked on with Timothy Renner and edited and put together something very special. Guys, if you think you know Bigfoot, you don't know nothing. And so that's why we're here with Josh tonight, straight from Georgia. How you doing, my man?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing as well as I can be in 2020. Let's put it that way.
Okay, good. Like we're all struggling, and we're all doing our best to keep it together, to keep them. Now, if you guys don't realize, so you guys, whoever hangs out on Paranormal Tuesday or See on the Other Side, you know that Wendy and I are musicians. But even though he doesn't express it as much in his writing because it's a different art form, Josh is a fellow musician as well. Why don't you tell us about some of the music you make, man?
Well, I am a tuba player, and I am I play New Orleans music. So a lot of traditional jazz, a lot of New Orleans brass band music. Normally, the two busiest times of year for me are the Mardi Gras season and the Oktoberfest season. But here we are in the middle of Oktoberfest season, and it's not very busy because of COVID. So, having said that, there are a couple of bands here in town that whenever their bass player is sick or something, they'll call me up and I'll sub for their bass player on tuba. So that's always a real special occasion. It's like, oh, I'm actually a real musician now.
Hold on, as a bass player, I don't know if I approve of this because
hey, come on, I just want a little slice of the pie, just a little slice of the pie.
You know, and it's funny, guys. So Josh graduated. He's a UW-Madison graduate. He's in Georgia now, so he's a Georgia Peach now. But used to be a Badger. And what year did you graduate from UW?
2007. I had to
Okay, so
no one's asked me that for a while. Yeah.
And my wife graduated from music school in 2006. So like it's all the big circle here. I just gonna and our guitar player Ben graduated with a tuba degree in 2000. And
right.
So I don't like the idea of tuba players thinking that they can replace bass players in general, because Ben's going to get some ideas.
Hey, turnabout is fair play. You know, we were holding down the bass line, and then all of a sudden amplification came along.
That's true. For like, you guys were working on it for a couple hundred years until bass players came in. All right. So that's it. So this book came out, I'd say, was it like 4 or 5 months ago now?
May. Mm-hmm.
May. Okay. So yeah, so 4 months. And I got to say, there's so many cool ideas into it. And I want to get a little bit behind your initial inspiration. Why get into this? Because growing up in the 1970s and 80s, I feel like Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the Yeti kind of thing, we were thinking of Bigfoot as a cryptozoology, a physical being. Bigfoot is just an undiscovered hominid. And when I'm reading Where the Footprints End, that blows up. And so what inspired you guys to get on the Bigfoot might not be just an undiscovered hominid train?
Well, I think that operating under the assumption that Bigfoot is an undiscovered hominid is a really natural place to start. Just as it's really natural to start with the UFO phenomena, thinking that it's extraterrestrials. I tend to have a real passion for looking at things in sort of a pan-paranormal framework. Whether or not that's misguided, I think that sometimes it is, to be quite honest. But I love finding these similarities between things. So this sort of a project was right up my alley, and I think that's the reason that I was approached by Timothy Renner, my co-author, about doing this project. I just finished Thieves in the Night, and I had twin boys on the way, and I was like, okay, I'm going to take some time off, and I'm not gonna write because I know I'm going to be busy. Yeah, and I was at the beach, and Tim messages me, and he's like, Bigfoot book about weird Bigfoot, and we didn't really know what shape it was going to take, but as there's a lot of comparison points to be made about Bigfoot and other sort of folklore and other high strange phenomena, and I
Okay, then.
kind of hate to admit it, but yeah.
Right. So you're saying, and here's the thing, because when we think of Bigfoot, you always think it's going to be somebody just sees like a mysterious creature in the woods, and like let's say you're in the Pacific Northwest, or you could be in the Kettle Moraine in Wisconsin, because we got plenty of Bigfoot sightings in here. We've only had one Bigfoot sighting in Madison, and they said they saw Bigfoot walking along Lake Monona. Or I'm sorry, Lake Mendota. Bigfoot walking along frozen Lake Mendota. And that was from Langdon Street. So everybody, Langdon Street's where all the frats are in Madison. So I have an idea.
My first thought was some substances might be involved.
I was going to say Bigfoot might have been smoking a joint that day. But this idea that you don't just see a creature, but other phenomena happen to you. Like this to me, really, in the past few years, was like a new idea. Like I'd always thought about it as like, no, Bigfoot is just a regular monkey. It's an orangutan. It's murders in the Rue Morgue and anything else. You're killing me. And what was the first time you had kind of heard about this, where it may have opened your mind to, okay, there's something else here?
Well, I was always very reluctant to even entertain this idea. I mean, people have been talking about Bigfoot being an interdimensional being or Bigfoot being seen alongside UFOs for a really long time. I mean, Stan Gordon chronicled the 1970s quite extensively. For me, the first time that I think I ever remembered hearing it was probably, back in my early, I think I heard of it when I started first looking into Bigfoot, but I was so concerned with like the, I guess not nuts and bolts, but rather tracks and turds approach.
Oh my God, I've never heard that before. That's so good. Yeah. Tracks and turds. I'm in.
For me, for the longest time, I was like, the only thing that's real in these unexplained topics is Bigfoot, and Bigfoot is probably an undiscovered primate. And look, there's a lot of fantastic science out there arguing that. Any of Jeff Meldrum's work points out a lot of things that are very specific to great ape anatomy that show up on these footprints. So I'm not denying that at all. So I was obsessed with that angle, and I probably heard about it here and there, but I always just sort of wrote it off as being silly. And one of the first podcasts that I started listening to when I started, my little Fortean renaissance in about 2012 or so, was probably Mysterious Universe, and I used to hear some silly stories then. But at that point, I was starting to look at the UFO topic from the angle of, altered states of consciousness and fairy folklore and things like that. And once you kick the door open on things like that and like psi phenomena, it's like, oh, well, maybe Bigfoot is really, really weird. So, I didn't realize quite how deep that rabbit hole went, though, until I really started looking into this book. I mean, it's when all's said and done, Volume 1 and Volume 2 are about 80 to 100,000 words each, and we could have probably put together another 100,000 words just in terms of the cases that we omitted, just for space's sake. And there's just a lot of strange stuff. Tends to what tends to emerge as sort of a of this phenomenon that people who have a one-off sighting, like a hunter or someone seeing a roadside crossing, tend to have a very tracks and turds interpretation of the creatures. They think that they're strictly animalistic and just like an undiscovered hominid, which again, very rational. Very rational observation, very rational viewpoint. But when you talk to people who have longitudinal experiences, people who claim to have Bigfoot on their property, that's when you get all these things that absolutely reek of basically spirit phenomena in the old world and in different traditions around the globe. Things like stone throwing, tapping on windows, running along rooftops. Just all these things that and as you're very fond of of championing the Brimstone Deceit, you're like the only person who likes that book. So I really
I'm in for the sulfur.
But the smell of encounters as well is another through line. So it's I'm definitely of the opinion that perhaps there is a legitimate flesh and blood creature out there whose imagery is sometimes adopted by these supernatural forces. If you think about the work of Mike Cleland, UFO experiencer, who's written extensively on
he's the owler guy.
Right, and I know Mike pretty well, and Mike is never going to say that there aren't such things as real owls. But at the same time, sometimes the owls are not owls. Like sometimes
when we talk to Mike Cleland, the owls are not what they seem, to quote Twin Peaks.
Exactly.
And then, every time my daughter mentions something about an owl, now I got to figure like, oh shit.
Yeah, I heard
she's
one
being
last
abducted.
Night, yeah, I heard one for the first time in a long time last night, and I was like, what's going on? But sometimes I wonder if there isn't a small population of relict hominids whose imagery is sometimes adopted as a mask, just like this other intelligence, whatever it may be, that lies behind the UFO phenomena sometimes adopts the imagery of the owl. It's just an idea that I play with. I think that Tim is probably less sympathetic to that idea than I am, because I just want to leave my foot in the door for that flesh and blood hypothesis, because there is some great research done on, again, these footprints and a lot of things that we see, and I don't want to dismiss that because there's been some really great research that's been done on that.
Also, Harry and the Hendersons. I love it. Great movie.
Yeah.
Fun movie.
There's anything really strange in Harry and the Hendersons? I don't think there is.
No, you get David Suchet as the hunter. Obviously, the John Lithgow at his most likable, and then Kevin Peter Hall, the Predator.
Yes.
The 8 foot tall basketball player from the Misfits of Science comes out. He just does a great job of making a sympathetic creature. And this is like, he's just a misunderstood ape. And I feel like,
and by all accounts, he was a great guy too, from what I understand.
Yes, right.
He was a real sweetheart.
The people that worked with him on I read the entire oral history of Misfits of Science. It's a really good book.
Oh wow, nice.
Yeah, it was like $2.99 on Amazon. I'm like, shit, I'm gonna buy that. But the thing is that this idea of Bigfoot as maybe a different kind of phenomena is a little scary in a way, I think, because then, like a hominid, a mammal, a Australopithecus or whatever. Now, that's something we can understand. That's a creature. It might be a different level of evolution, but we probably share 2/3 of a brain, or even more, like a Neanderthal. And so all of a sudden, when you think of it's an alien intelligence inside of it, that starts to get, that turns Bigfoot from like the friendly guy from Harry and the Hendersons to, well, what's inside the alien intelligence? And that's kind of, so Alice, my sister Allison, was wondering, she was like, well, how can we connect Bigfoot to fairy phenomena? And this side, And we're not talking about Tinkerbell, yo, right? We're talking about like elementals who are aliens on Earth and intelligences that can operate in different ways than humans can. And so where were the first times that you were finding places where Bigfoot might be connected to some of the traditional fairy phenomena?
I think the first place that I ever really made that connection was in these anecdotal accounts of Bigfoot braiding horses' manes. Really silly, I realize that.
Wait,
There
Bigfoot
are
like a
eyewitnesses
hairstylist.
who claim to have actually observed this phenomena happening.
He shows
Yeah.
up with a big pick, and he's just like, "Oh, it's okay, buddy. It's okay." Like, so Bigfoot now that could be Bigfoot. That could be a very human thing, right? Or that could also be like, he has a connection to these animals that we can never understand.
Yeah, again, that's entirely possible. Sometimes these connections that you mentioned get a little bit more graphic. There's there are eyewitness accounts of sexual assault by Bigfoot on livestock, if those reports are to be believed. So people claim that Bigfoot braids horses' manes. This is a pretty common claim in the Bigfoot community. But these exact same accusations in the old world were leveled at witches and fairies themselves. It's interesting how our culture has its own, its own monster archetype, and we attribute the same set of behaviors to Bigfoot that they would have, attributed to fairies in Dartmoor in, the 19th century. But then you start looking at some more of the literature, and the similarities become even more congruent. I mentioned, stone throwing, tapping on windows, raps, wood knocks, sounds of something on the roof.
Well,
you have the
stone throwing real quick. Now, that's bringing Bigfoot into the poltergeist phenomena. But because it's very, like poltergeist, like the idea of something throwing rocks on the roof seems to be very popular from poltergeists from the Middle Ages on. And Bigfoot doing the same thing. I've met some people that have seen Bigfoot, right? And I'm sure you have too, Josh. But the one time I actually was kind of affected by someone's sighting was at the Milwaukee Paranormal Conference in 2016. And we're sitting at Shaker's Cigar Bar in Milwaukee, and I'm like going up to order a drink. And this woman comes up to me and she goes, "Oh, do you know anything about Bigfoot?" And I'm like, "Honey, I don't know anything about anything. I'm at a paranormal conference. Like, I'm here for fun, and but I'd love to talk about it." So I said, "Well, what do you know?" And then she goes in and tells me about her story in Marquette, Michigan, where she was chased by Bigfoot. She feels like her family's property. He was there, and she's like, he would just throw rocks at the windows. And he kept on throwing rocks at the windows, and sometimes you'd hear it in the middle of the night, and then sometimes you would get up and you would look outside and you would see something running away. And it's the idea that, like, in other places, that might be a poltergeist phenomena. And now it's Bigfoot. And to hear that from somebody who looked like they were about to crap their pants when they were talking about it. Like, all of a sudden, I'm like, okay, guys, I'm in.
Yeah, it's very affecting when you can talk to people like that. And so, to be clear, because people are going to push back a little bit, yes, throwing stones is an observed primate behavior. But what I find really interesting is that in some of these cases, so there's this entire rabbit hole you can go down with what they call Class B reports, according to the BFRO, which are reports where people see things associated with Bigfoot, but they never actually see a Bigfoot themselves. So vocalizations, wood knocks, footprints.
That's the Bigfoot Research Organization, the BFRO is what you're talking about.
Yes, thank you for clarifying. Yeah. Anyway, so all this suite of phenomena that are suggestive of Bigfoot. But the interesting thing is, if any of those things happened inside a house, you'd label all of that poltergeist phenomena.
Right.
So, and even to the extent, I mean, there was a famous case, I believe it was in the 1970s. I don't have the exact date pulled up at hand, but the Minerva monster case of Minerva, Ohio,
Oh
where the
yeah.
kids would like pick up stones and they'd mark on the stones with an X and they'd throw it up, on the ridge line, and something would throw it back. And they said that the stone would be warm to the touch. Now, the assumption is that, well, the Bigfoot was holding it in its hand and that's why it was warm to the touch. But that's a very common thing in poltergeist cases, is that when you have these, apports of stones that often fall from the ceiling inside the house out of nowhere, they are warm or hot to the touch. So it really is all about context. That the two places where poltergeists seem to appear are around a focus of a focal point of a young child or something, and seances. And people have manifested hairy hands and hairy creatures in seances. So what are we really looking at here? It's so location and context dependent, the way that we interpret these phenomena.
Well, I would love to do a seance and hairy hands show up. Usually when I'm doing the Ouija board, nothing happens. So I'd be totally excited. Well, you made a good point, though, when you were talking about if these things were inside, they'd be poltergeist phenomena. And it almost seems like, and you said that there'll be pushback. People will say that, yeah, a primate is going to throw stones. Well, we're still talking about an undiscovered primate, so that would be great. But do you think that there seems to be a weird washing on Bigfoot stuff? Like, is there a popular way of talking about it, or a popular way of approaching this phenomena? Because I know Lauren Coleman, like when you ask Lauren, and he is a cryptozoologist, he's the guy that kept Bigfoot alive right through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Like, I mean, Lauren really is a great guy, nice guy. And he is all about Bigfoot is a physical being. Do you think the generation that maybe he comes from, or the people with that idea, might try to take away the weirdness from it and concentrate on the nuts and bolts evolution aspect of it or something?
I think that is a fair point of criticism. I think that Tim is probably a little bit more in that camp, that yes, people are weird washing. But I've heard it from other people involved with some of these organizations that they will literally throw out cases or omit certain details. Hats off to Lauren. I mean, he's kept this topic relevant for so long, and he is not blind to these similarities. He's he and I might disagree on some of the finer points, but he's also pointed out the similarities between Bigfoot and poltergeist activity as well. But I do think that there is this urge on a lot of these topics for paranormal researchers to want to sit at the big kids table of science. And that's the reason why, well, I mean, an undiscovered relic hominid is unpalatable enough. If you start bringing on this crazy woo stuff, it's going to be even more difficult to justify. Similarly with the UFO phenomena, we know that what we would do is we would go to the stars and collect, but at the same time, these people who embrace the nuts and bolts interpretation of the UFO phenomena also admit that things like telepathy occur. So we're already playing in some murky waters to begin with. Science is going to literally, I would expect it any day now, acknowledge that the research on psi phenomena is really good, and if the research on psi phenomena is really holds up to scrutiny, then we've got to rethink the way that we talk about all these topics. But
I agree. I tell you, my experimental psychology class in 1996, we all had to run an experiment, so I decided to do a Gonsfeld experiment. Right?
Nice.
I had 30 people from my dorm, and we beat chance. They said 30 people was what you needed to be able to do the statistics. Mm-hmm. And I had everybody in one dorm room, like, put on headphones like this, right? I didn't have ping pong balls. I mean, I guess I had to cut them. But instead, we just put a blindfold and had another person try to send a picture of a painting, a painting. And then we would show the person the painting, or like a variety of paintings. They just pick them out. And so we beat chance 40% to 25, which is what you could expect from this certain experiment. And I'm like, we just replicated the Gansfeld in a dorm, and that idea that, and they can consistently replicate it above chance, usually about 33% to what you would expect, would be less than 25%. And it seems like the rest of the scientific world needs to catch up with parapsychologists like Nancy Zangroni and stuff like that, who are doing this kind of work and just say like, yep, something weird's going on. We don't know what it is yet.
Well, I think it was Colonel John V. Alexander who claimed, and this may be spurious, but he claimed that there's less peer-reviewed research supporting ibuprofen's efficacy than there is for psi phenomena's existence. So it's kind of like a done deal for me. But a good example of this weird washing in this way that people will omit things is the Ape Canyon story. Are you familiar with that story of Bigfoot encounter?
I am familiar with it, but I don't know that all of our listeners and watchers are. So, Josh, let's hear about Ape Canyon. I love it.
Well, Ape Canyon was it's a very, very famous case. It's oftentimes brought forth as one of these landmark tracks and turds cases of describing an undiscovered hominid attacking people. But there were several their cabin attacked about 2 miles east of Mount St. Helens in 1924 that summer, and the story kind of got exaggerated over time. From what I can tell from some of the original documents, it looks like the apes were, slapping the cabin and tossing rocks and reaching through the slats in the logs of the cabin. But it sort of evolved over time into like them throwing boulders at the cabin, whatever. Anyway, the area has become known as Ape Canyon, and one of the people that we know about this story from is Fred Beck, who was one of this group of 5 miners who ended up taking a pot shot at a large blackish brown-haired creature, and that night was when they had the siege of their cabin that actually happened. And you always hear it talked about in these terms, but what people tend to omit is the fact that Fred Beck went to his grave absolutely convinced that Beck had a long-standing experience with the paranormal from being a child, and even some of the events around Ape Canyon itself were really strange. He claimed to have seen this Indian spirit guide who told him to follow a white arrow in the sky to their mining claim. Once they got to their mining claim, they named it after another spirit guide of Beck's, named a lady spirit named Vander White. He never really described her that much. They heard strange, like mechanical sounds coming from underneath the ground at their mining claim. Even though there was no, existing mining operation. There was another instance that was really interesting, where on a sandbar, there were these 2 footprints in the middle of a river on the sandbar that just were, 4 inches deep. And the sandbar itself was like an acre wide, big river, big sandbar, and nothing leading to or from these 2 footprints. And one of the other miners said, no human being could have made these tracks back up. And Fred Beck, while at the mining site, actually had a pencil a port into his hand. Now, none of this means that these apes were necessarily paranormal entities, but as, Timothy is fond of saying, he's like, it's a strange thing to see Bigfoot. It's a strange thing to see a UFO or to have, in a port or something like that. It's really, really strange to have these things happening in close proximity, either geographically or, temporally. It defies the idea that it's not somehow connected. It would be even more miraculous than it being these disparate phenomena. So, but nobody ever talks about that. It really does seem like there has been an effort, especially in the Ape Canyon case, to dismiss those other aspects because they feel like the cryptozoological community feels like it undermines their argument, and it kind of does. But once you start seeing the consistency of these archetypes and these different folkloric creatures and entities,
right,
it sort of reinforces the argument.
But when we go into this, though, when we talk about how that Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it, might not be just a hominid, but might be something a little bit wackier. Doesn't that go back to the original indigenous explanations of this idea of a creature that could pass through? Like, I was talking to somebody in the Wisconsin Dells where we have a ghost tour. And in the Wisconsin Dells, I was just telling him about the ghost tour we do and things. And he goes, "You guys are talking about Bigfoot?" And I'm like, "Well, I have no Bigfoot sightings in the downtown Wisconsin Dells, so no. We don't talk about Bigfoot, but I love Bigfoot." And the guy's like, "Well, I used to hang out with a lot of local Indians, and when we wanted to talk about Bigfoot, they would talk about, these trees that would fold over and touch the ground. And if a tree had grown so much and then had bent itself towards the sun till it eventually touched the ground, that became a portal. And that's where Bigfoot came through. And that's what they were, that's what the traditional people in the tribe told him." And I'm like, "Well, I don't know if that's true, but that's awesome." I was like, but that idea of, okay, the indigenous people were there before we were, literally and metaphorically, when it comes to Bigfoot, and the idea that it's a creature who exists beyond the physical realm. And so when you guys were doing research for where the footprints end, did you get into the indigenous American stories?
Absolutely. There was a real conscious effort on the behalf of Tim and I to, not try to treat these cultures as monolithic and to really try to get as granular as we could about specific tribal beliefs and, really talk about individual tribes' beliefs, because it's a vast array of cultures, and it's a vast array of beliefs within those cultures. You'll find cultures that say that it's an animal, some cultures that say that it's a spirit, some cultures that say that it's an animal with, extra paranatural abilities. And you'll find some people saying that, they're sort of incredibly magically operant, hairy people. So you'll really find a broad spectrum of beliefs. And it's interesting. You can kind of see phenomena mirrored in cryptozoology, because I personally am kind of the idea that with the ancient alien stuff, older cultures weren't mistaking aliens for gods. We are mistaking gods for aliens in sort of a way. But there really is a broad spectrum of beliefs, and a lot of them, even the most mundane ones, do tend to ascribe some vaguely supernatural abilities to these creatures. And what I find really interesting is that you'll find that a lot of these same ideas 100% mimicked in the wild man tradition of Europe. And if you start to unpack what that might mean, like on an archetypal level, it really seems like mankind is tapping into these same archetypes, and either, the most mundane thing is that the collective unconscious is real.
Right. Like Jung was right. We're like, oh, I guess all Jungian psychology, like, he's got it.
Oh yeah, he's aged a lot better than Freud has. That's for sure.
Right. I can smoke a cigar, and it doesn't have to be weird. Meanwhile, with archetypes, talking about the wild man, this idea that there is somebody in the woods who is human-like, but not quite human. And then also having a connection to the elementals, like the wild, the idea of connection to nature. Connection is something that, like, I'm not sure when humans separated from nature, and I'm not sure if it was a function of the prefrontal cortex or something like that differentiated us from instinct and from the rest of the world. But it seems like we think that this wild man, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti, this tradition, of someone closer to, I mean, a mountain man, right? Someone who can hear the birds. Like, it's Grizzly fucking Adams.
Yeah, it's Merlin. It's Papagenu, to throw in a little magic flute reference there. And I mean, but literally, like Merlin was a wild man. Merlin was born hairy and consorted with all the beings of the forest and had his familiars, and he was, and if you really unpack the wild man, that rich wild man tradition of Western Europe, I'm saying that specifically. You can go into Eurasia, even indigenous. But the wild man, as we are sort of conditioned to understand it as Westerners, that
Sure.
wild man tradition of Western Europe, you find out how closely related it is to fairy phenomena, how closely related it is to witches, how closely related it is to even ghosts and other spirit phenomena. And from there you get a really good lay of the land for how these other traditions are resonant in Bigfoot lore. I mean, there are things about Bigfoot that seem like they're right out of ghost stories. I was amazed to find that there are similarities between old world witch traditions and Bigfoot as well. I mean, sometimes Baba Yaga, the Russian witch that loved to steal children,
the evil Baba Yaga.
Sometimes she was hairy. And she was also sometimes arrow-proof, and you have all these stories nowadays of Bigfoot being bulletproof. And another.
Let's go back real quick though. Let's go
Sure.
back. Bigfoot and ghosts. And so, our friend, mutual friend Greg Newkirk, right? He's got a T-shirt that says Bigfoot is a ghost, and he sells that, and it's usually just to piss people off at paranormal conventions. What, when you guys were working on this and putting together the stories and the writers and stuff, where did you find any connections between, like you said, like, oh, Bigfoot and traditional ghost stories? Like, that's something I think that most people do not understand the connection of. And either, I would like to hear more about it too.
Well, part of the challenge in this book was finding these aspects of Bigfoot reports that are odd and they're outliers, and trying to find a place to give them a home within the book. So we weren't about to write a chapter on bulletproof Bigfoot or a chapter on invisible or cloaking Bigfoot. Still get talked about in depth, but they found a home in things like the ghost chapter, because ghosts would be bulletproof and ghosts would be invisible as well. So setting aside all the stuff that we talked about, the similarities between Bigfoot, Class B reports and poltergeist activity, which, I don't think that poltergeists are spirit phenomena so much as they're psi phenomena, but, tabling that issue, there are a lot of
I'm with you.
Bigfoot.
I'm still old school
Yeah.
telekinesis. It's got to be like some adolescent whose hormones are raging and all of a sudden shit goes wild. It's Firestarter.
Absolutely. But it was really common for a lot of newspapers to describe these Bigfoot encounters as hairy ghosts. Like, that was a go-to, 19th century, early 20th century phrase for describing these things as hairy ghosts. And that would be sort of like attributes. Then you compound that with the fact that there is some indigenous traditions that explicitly link Bigfoot to ghosts and to the spirits of the dead. For example, the one of my favorite Bigfoot traditions is the Kwakiutl Bookwis of the Alaskan tribe. Not only do they have similarities between their Bookwis and the fairy folklore, which is where if a Bookwis gives you food, you'll be trapped with the Bookwis forever, which is just like the food taboo from Western European fairy traditions.
Oh man,
But
I was just telling my wife about something the other day. We were watching something, and I was like somebody, I forget what show we were watching, but it was somebody in a fairyland, and I'm like, "Don't eat the food, you'll be there forever." And she's like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "It's fairies. You wouldn't understand."
Yep. So that's if you take one, folks. That's the thing to remember. But in their tradition, the Bookwis also is sort of the being that presides over the drowned dead. And you'll find similar traditions throughout, North America of these large hairy creatures sort of presiding over the dead in almost a judgment capacity, or being described as spirits or ghosts. And then, you sort of, like I said, you've got these other features like Bigfoot being able to pass through things, Bigfoot being invisible, Bigfoot doing this, that, and the other, that get nested in that chapter as well. One of the things that this book tries to do is say that a lot of the arguments that cryptozoologists will put forward to excuse some of the odd outliers are not really sound. For example, we talk about bulletproof Bigfoot. Well, not only are, ghosts non-corporeal, they can't be but it was very common in the old world to see witches be bulletproof. I mean, there was one example of a witch trial where they tried to cut the witch's hair with scissors, and allegedly, it actually ended up breaking the scissors because her hair was so tough. So you see that again mirrored in the Bigfoot tradition, but also, people will say, well, Bigfoot's got really thick skin, or Bigfoot has a really thick layer of fat. But, what Tim and I tried to do was to look at the science.
How's Bigfoot gonna get shot? Like even big guys like Rasputin, right? He could take a bunch of shots, but you still got him. Like Bigfoot is gnarly.
I never made that comparison. Yeah, I never made that comparison. Well, people like to trot out this idea that Bigfoot's skin is thick. Well, that is completely inconsistent with primate physiology. Primates have the thickest skin on the least hairy parts of their body. And so if you think about, a scalp injury versus, an arm injury, that automatically even in giants. And then, this idea that there's a thick layer of fat. I mean, I've seen videos of grizzly bears being stopped, at least, by something as, as weak as birdshot from a shotgun. And you have these stories of people shooting Bigfoot with high-powered rifles at point-blank range, and the things don't even flinch. It just doesn't make sense to me. So, we really try to be as thorough as we can in unpacking some of these inconsistencies and some of the faulty logic that's trotted out to explain some of the stranger aspects. And again, look, if somebody captures a flesh and blood Bigfoot tomorrow, I'm going to be ecstatic.
Well, what do you think about the Minnesota Iceman?
Oh, boy. That story is so convoluted. I actually have a chapter dedicated to the sort of emergence of the trickster archetype in Bigfoot hoaxing and the Bigfoot community in Volume 2 into 2021. But the Minnesota Iceman story, I think that it was something legitimate at one point. And then I think that it's obviously was replaced at some point. But it's to me that really speaks to the fact that we're not dealing with a flesh and blood creature. Because
wait, have you seen the Minnesota Iceman?
I have not.
Okay, I have.
I was supposed to go to Austin this year with some of my friends to the Museum of the Weird, where they apparently have the.
Well, come down to South by Southwest next year, and we'll all hang out and do a Sunspot show, and we'll go to the Museum of the Weird. But the Minnesota Iceman is, I don't know. It looks like a monkey costume under ice.
Yeah, and we were talking about Lauren. I mean, he was pretty instrumental in pointing out some of the between the originals that Hubelmans and Sanderson took, and this supposed facsimile that was created. But again, when you look at all these paranormal phenomena, there really seems to be this self-negating aspect that's built into it. I mean, you have poltergeist cases that are completely legit, and then they get the activity dies down, and you get the impression that the girls or the boys who were involved in it sort of had to start faking it to keep up the expectations that they were in, which it ends up making the entire event seem like a hoax from the beginning.
Right.
And you'll find this. I think a good point of comparison is in a lot of the UFO contactee literature. I think a lot of those people had a genuine experience of some sort, whether you want to qualify it as extraterrestrial or spiritual or whatever. But then they got attention, and they felt like they had to keep on faking it, because
to keep it going. No, to keep the story going. Yeah. That's a really good point. And I was just thinking about that this weekend when I was talking to Allison, and we're talking about all the people we know. who are like, you got to keep the money rolling in at a certain point. And it does make it hard.
And I think from a Jungian perspective, that's the trickster archetype bubbling to the surface. And I think that, you talk about the trickster and people think there's a capital T trickster god
A
that's
Nancy
behind this.
or whatever.
And that's yeah. And that's not really, I think, what people are talking about. They're talking about just the same way that, when you go to, a hospital, the archetype of the mother is invoked, or
The
when you go
nurse,
to a
right.
hotel, the archetype of the mother. Well, the sort of mothering instinct. And
Right.
I think that sort of trickster thing, for whatever reason, hovers above all this phenomena, and because whatever's behind the phenomena is in complete control of how it manifests and how what access we have to evidence, and that it quality. And I think that things like Minnesota Iceman, another example, the 2008 Georgia Bigfoot hoax,
Oh,
is
that
another
killed
great
me.
example.
I was mad about that one. Speaking of states, we got MJ from the UK, and she's like, "What about the Ohio Grassman?" I don't know. I don't know too much about the Ohio Grass. Josh, what about him?
It's sort of a regional name for Bigfoot. You find it around like Salt Fork State Park and some of those really great Ohio areas of Bigfoot activity. I mean, people think about Bigfoot being in the Pacific Northwest, and while that's true, Ohio is another one of those states that just has a ton of activity. Ohio and Texas, actually, North Georgia, believe it or not, has a lot of activity. And of course, Florida with the skunk ape tradition. But in terms of the Grassman, I think we're all sort of talking about the different names for the. Some strange stories in Ohio that are in the book as well. It doesn't seem like any state is really
Except Hawaii.
To this strange. Yeah, well, actually,
What?
depending on what you look at, there are stories of hairy giants that you can find in Hawaii. I know that's you're completely justified in saying that, because that's been the long-standing factoid, is that 49 states have had Bigfoot sightings, but not Hawaii. But that's just because people, I don't think, are really. I mean, I can think of 3 different cases between the 2 books of large hairy things in Hawaii. One of them was called a wild man, which, when you sort of get to that 19th century newspaper reporting, could mean a hermit, or could mean a wild man or a hairy creature. But there's another instance that I'm thinking of, where these 2 boys saw a large hairy giant. So it's the Bigfoot is not seen in Hawaii thing is not entirely correct, and to say that Bigfoot isn't in Hawaii would be a another check mark on the flesh and blood hypothesis.
It's discriminating against Hawaiians, and we're not interested in that.
But I mean, there are sightings of hairy hominids in the UK, which I find a lot less likely than large hairy hominids in the Pacific Northwest.
Right. Speaking of, I'm looking for footage of any cryptids for the UK paranormal TV show I'm currently putting together. If anybody has any, I would like to have it featured on the show. So that's MJ from Sage Tribe. And if you guys have any of that, just send it to us. We'll make sure it gets to her. Or you can find her, Sage Tribe, MJ Dixon. If Bigfoot's in the UK, that is a definite kind of anarchy in the UK we are interested in hearing about. So that's awesome. Speaking of stories, though,
yeah.
Allison
there was
did find she found a story. And let me find it here, because she just put it in, and it was a story that somebody told to her at a paranormal convention. And let me grab that here. It was in my Evernote. And I think I might have lost it.
I'm just going to let you keep on being as awkward as you want to be.
Yeah, no. I just found it because she found that. I was like, I wanted to make sure I wanted to tell you this story because I wanted to share it with you. But I'm afraid I might have lost that note in Evernote in the mysteries of the internet while we were talking and while I was putting everything together. but basically it was a Bigfoot story of someone hearing talking to somebody that had a high strangeness, and they didn't know what to deal with it. They didn't know how to handle a Bigfoot story that seemed to have a paranormal aspect to it. So when you guys were working on the book and putting it together and everything, you're like, okay, now we are concentrating on the weirdness, the paranormal aspects, the beyond cryptozoology aspects of it. How did that, like, when you were talking to people or working the writing or following up on anything, what was the way you could present yourself to people so they wouldn't feel crazy or you wouldn't ask crazy? You wouldn't act crazy when you're saying, like, hey, Bigfoot, right? He also can fly. Like, how did you get into that?
Well, I mean, one of the ways, a lot of people will push back on, well, Bigfoot has to be physical because it leaves footprints and hair and scat and blood and all this stuff. But the first thing that you say is that this idea of things being physical or non-physical is a very, like, Western way of thinking of things. And, the people who say that Bigfoot can't be, some sort of spirit phenomena because it leaves footprints are incredibly ignorant of, some of the oldest ghost hunting techniques, which were to spread talcum powder on the floor and wait for footprints to manifest. Or, the fact that ghosts can slam doors. I mean, that's a physical, manifestation in our world. Psi phenomena, again, is something that's intangible, but can leave a physical change on the world. And you can look at some of these other things like hair and, droppings or whatever, similar to the way that you might look at ectoplasm seances, sort of a reified, physicalized version of this phenomena, whatever it may be. But my thing is just coming back to the honesty that you have to have. It's okay to believe someone when they say that they saw a large hairy monkey man cross the road, but if you say that it crossed the road and you saw a UFO in the sky 10 minutes later, we're just going to leave that part out. That just seems, if you believe a witness, you believe a witness, and that seems dishonest. I had a podcaster talk to me who said, like, well, maybe if someone sees Bigfoot disappear and they're not familiar with the terrain, maybe Bigfoot just jumped behind a tree or jumped into a ditch. And my response was, there are people who are looking straight at these things and they blink out of existence. And if you walk back that logic of like, oh, well, Bigfoot, just jumped into a trench or, Bigfoot jumped behind a tree, you keep walking back that style of logic and you wind up saying, because it conforms to my understanding of the world, what you saw must have been a bear. So I think it really is important to take people's testimony at face value. Now, if you want to pick apart individual cases, that's fine, but I think there really is this critical mass of weirdness behind a lot of these things that suggests that in at least a good portion of cases that we're dealing with something that's a little bit stranger than just an undiscovered primate.
Well, I'm 1,000% with you, because I used to be Mr. Nuts and Bolts. I used to be Mr. Bigfoot is a hominid. I used to be all the things like ghosts. Okay, they're recordings. We haven't figured it out. I used to be Mr. I used to be the Richard Dawkins of the paranormal, basically. Right? I was like, I don't buy it. Yeah. But then too many things connect in weird ways, and I had too many experiences going to places and doing these things. And I'm like, I can't figure it out. And so when you're saying, I like what you're saying, take them at face value for the story, because don't try to explain around it, because there will be a time for explaining around it. But when you're listening to someone and talking to someone, you have to hear what they experienced. And here's the experience. I found Allison's experience that she got from this UFO conference. And let me read it to you. I met this former policeman named Dave at a MUFON conference. He stopped me after my talk and asked me the strange experience he and his wife had because I made it clear in my talk that I was interested in all types of strange phenomena. Dave said that he was really just interested in UFOs, but that something strange happened to him and his wife in 1990, and it still confounds him. He said that they were sitting on the end of their waterbed. Rich bourgeoisie. Casually talking when these brown hands came up in the middle of the far side of the bed, over the thick side padding, he said, like waterbeds. The hands appeared somewhat simian, pulled up a seemingly curious head obscured by a mop of long brown hair, although no eyes were visible. It seemed to him whatever it was taking a look at them. Just as suddenly the head popped back down, the couple jumped off the bed to see where it had gone, and of course, nothing was there. He said the thing reminded him of Cousin It, and his wife revealed to him that she and her sister had seen a similar thing when she was 10 years old. She remembered seeing a smaller creature climb over her in her sister's bed, and then she remained still, and the little creature curled up and went to sleep on her tummy. And she doesn't remember what happened after that. But simian hands dragging Cousin It to look at them on the side of a waterbed. And like, what do you think about that? I'm like, Bigfoot's interdimensional, yo.
Well, you know, that Cousin It description shows up especially with a lot of you know, east of the Mississippi Bigfoot or large hairy hominid cases, you know. And what's more, you know, this hairy hand thing is a motif. I mean, hairy hands were manifested in seances, as we mentioned earlier, but also there's a road in the UK where hairy hands will just reach out and grab your steering wheel, apparently. There's a lot of stories. That
and on the left side of the road, too, which means you're doubly fucked.
But also, you know, there's an entire chunk of the book that's dedicated to Bigfoot appearing in sleep paralysis cases, and Bigfoot is one of these John Keelian bedroom invaders. So, I mean, all that really does track. And you know, when you look at the fact that, you know, not to throw a monkey wrench in here too late in the game, but you know, when you look at witches familiars, they typically tended to be like, you know, fauna of the you know, native fauna, like rabbits and crows and, you know, birds and, you know, weasels and stuff, and apes. It was always like, you know, native animals and apes, and it's always like, well, why did they throw apes in there? And then you look at, you know, sleep paralysis being caused by witches. I never thought of
apes as a witch's familiar, like an idea.
Oh, it's a thing. Yeah,
and that gets back to Beast of Bray Road here in Wisconsin, which, you know, people sometimes talk about as a cryptid, or otherwise they talk about as a, like, it was brought forth with some kind of activity. And so that's interesting that people also have Bigfoot experiences or something similar. Oh, man. Well, we got to talk about witches at a totally different time, Josh. And I got to say, everybody out there, I want you to read Where the Footprints End, because you are going to have a totally different idea about Bigfoot than you would have had. It's really interesting, fascinating. When is, you said number 2 is coming out at the end of 2021?
Should be at the end of, at the end of this year.
The end of 2020.
We're in the edit. Yeah, we're in the editing stages, but, you know, depending on how hectic everybody's life gets, it might get pushed into the first couple of weeks of 2021. But
the
for
world
right now,
is
we're on
insane.
target for the end of 2020.
Right.
Yeah.
It's all like right. I'm sitting there. There's flames behind me. I don't really live in California. The world is insane. So, Josh, everybody who's interested in your work and stuff like that, what's the website they can go to find more about Josh Cutchin and the great stuff you're putting out?
JoshuaCutchin.com, JoshuaCutchin.com. And that has pretty much everything that you need there. Links to my books and where you can buy them. Unfortunately, this book is pretty much published through Amazon, so don't get me started. I love independent bookstores as much as anybody else, and I support them every chance I can get. But when you're self-publishing, you have some limited options. And also, you know, all my interviews, and I'm trying to get better about updating the blog. You know, I don't do a lot of short form writing, so it's not exactly my cup of tea. But I try to keep people at least up to date on when they can see me, and, you know, presentations and whatnot, and that sort of thing.
So keep an eye out. Go to JoshuaCutchin.com and please follow him and check out where the footprints end. I've enjoyed this book. It really is something different because these are different ways to look at phenomena that we thought we kind of had a grasp on. And that's what makes it interesting. If you guys out there are enjoying what you hear, please check out patreon.com/sunspotmusic. We're having a Patreon hangout tomorrow night. We'll be hanging out with all the Patreons, talking about horror movies and paranormal and rock and roll and all that kind of fun stuff. Please check that out if you'd like. Josh, good luck to you. And we can't wait to hear about the next book and what you're doing. And thank you for giving us a different perspective on The Biggest Defeat.
Oh, thanks so much, Mike. It's always a great time talking to you.